Good evening, and thank you for attending our Iowa History Book Club. We are so glad that you are here, virtually, of course. My name is Andrew Klump, and I am the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. Every quarter, the State Historical Society hosts a book club during which we hear from authors and historians and discuss all periods and areas of Iowa history. You can learn more about this series and our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov, where you can sign up for other upcoming book clubs we have up through our spring announced. You can check those out there. Today, we are kicking off our 2024 Iowa History Book Club series and celebrating Iowa History Month with a new history of Iowa by my friend Jeff Bremer. But before we jump into the conversation today, a few housekeeping points. First, closed captioning is available. You can find that at the bottom bar on your screen or on your Zoom. That can be activated there. We can all look forward to a question and answer with Jeff at the end as well. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at any point throughout the evening. My colleague, Jessica Runlet, and I will receive those when you enter them into the chat, and I'll be able to pose those questions to the speaker. Please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our very best. So that's in the Q&A feature. Go ahead and add those questions anytime. And finally, by participating in book club, you agree to do so respectfully with our presenters and our hosts and other webinars and other participants. Primarily, that again is going to be through that Q&A feature. And with that, I am really pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Jeff Bremer. Dr. Bremer is a professor of history at Iowa State University, although this evening he is joining us from Poland, where it is currently late in the night, and he's completing a Fulbright fellowship. He teaches classes at Iowa State on the early American Republic, Iowa history, and social studies methods. He's a former social history teacher from California, and he helps to coordinate ISU's history and social studies education program. He's also served as a Fulbright scholar at Northeast Normal University in China, so has traveled the world. His first book is A Store Almost in Sight, The Economic Transformation of Missouri from Louisiana Purchase to the Civil War, which was published in 2014. And his most recent book, what we're all here to discuss tonight, was published last year by the University of Kansas Press, and it is A New History of Iowa. So we are excited to jump in, and thanks for joining us tonight, Jeff.
Andrew, thanks for having me on, and thank you for the very kind and gracious introduction. Yeah, I always feel better about myself every time I talk to you.
Well, I don't say anything that isn't true. So there you go.
Thank you.
Well, so one of my favorite ways to kind of kick off a book club, when we talk to our speakers and our authors, I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in this topic and why'd you decide to pursue writing this new history of Iowa?
Well, in 2011, I had the good fortune to be hired by Iowa State University to run their history education program. And part of that hiring was that I'd also teach Iowa history. Since Dorothy Schweeder had retired, no one had taught that subject in about 10 years. And so I was hired with the understanding that I would do those two things, history education and also Iowa history. I was finishing the book on Missouri and considering a next project when I applied for the job here, and I had thought about a book on frontier Iowa. And as I began to teach Iowa history about 2014, and I've taught it for about 10 years, I began to realize there were things that could be added to the narrative of the state. There were some gaps in our previous knowledge, and that topics could be explored. The history could be updated of the farm crisis, of the Great Depression, of the Civil War. And as I dug around more, I realized there was a tremendous variety of sources, thanks in large part to the State Historical Society. So those are the reasons how I ended up writing the book. It's been a joy. It's also been a little bit of time to get it done, but that's because there were so many sources.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is really the first one-volume synthesis of Iowa history since Dorothy Schweeder's book, over 25 years ago now.
Yeah, and her book is the gold standard in Iowa history. Hers was the first really comprehensive history of the state that looked at social, economic, political, cultural history. Leland Sage had written a book in the 70s called A History of Iowa, which was mostly a political history of Iowa.
Mhm.
So Sweeter, who taught Iowa history for decades, decided she needed to write something that was comprehensive, that included the narrative and the story of women and African Americans and immigrants. And her book is it's quoted in every chapter. Schweter is the dean of Iowa historians and will be for generations to come.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in the editing the annals, I think she's quoted in every annals article we publish, or nearly all of them.
Yes.
If I get something, often one of the comments back is, "Oh, you should look at this thing that Schweter did,"
Mhm.
and this is the next, I guess, the next iteration of that kind of volume in our state's history.
Well, about when someone did a review, I think it was James Madison of Schweter's book back in the late 90s. He had said every generation or so, someone comes along and writes a history based upon what the topics are interested in, what is important at the time they write. And so in a couple decades, someone will come along and they will write something that builds upon what Schweter and I have done.
Hmm. I wonder, like you mentioned a little bit, all the sources and things like that, but was there any part of the research and writing process for this book that surprised you? And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, what was most surprising was it took 9 years. I had originally pitched this book thinking I could get it done in 5 years or so, and that was incredibly optimistic. And the more I dug into the sources, the more I looked at the State Historical Society, or looked at what had been published, or looked at the Annals of Iowa, or the other journals from the state, the more I realized there was an immense amount of material that needed to be sifted through. And that's why it took almost 10 years.
Mhm.
Fortunately, it's a good problem to have. Too many sources is better than not enough. And everything from the great publication efforts by the University of Iowa Press and Iowa State University, who between them published almost 100 books I used in my book, and that the State Historical Society also published books. There's been a number of great journals published by the Historical Society, and digitization of everything from journals to newspapers has allowed you to exploit and find more sources. And of course, the archival material at the State Historical Society, both in Iowa City and Des Moines, is just incredible.
Mhm.
Um, and if you want to see what I used in the book, the bibliography is available on my faculty webpage at the ISU website for the history
Mhm.
department. 350, 360 primary sources, um, half of which, well, I think half of everything from that's included in the book comes from University of Iowa, Iowa State University, or one of the State Historical Society branches.
Mhm. I think it was fun for me. As the editor of one of the publications, or the publication of the State Historical Society, and kind of having inherited, the office, is to see all that you sifted through, how much you've read of really the thousands and thousands of articles that we've just, that's just our portfolio here. It was really astonishing and impressive, I think, as someone who shepherds some of these publications today.
And some of the things quoted, I have been under your editorship, and tons more under Marvin Bergman,
Hmm.
and all the predecessors, both Annals of Iowa, the Iowa Journal of History, Iowa Journal of History Politics, and other publications. It's a
Hmm.
fantastic wealth of material.
Hmm. Yeah, they're wonderful, and we not just a little plug of ours. All that, especially making them available online. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, all those publications are fully available online, and we get millions of downloads a year. People engaging with that great content. We're grateful. So
I'm grateful it's there. Hmm.
yes, and I even appreciate how quickly I can find it online. It's just really nice when I don't have to run down and grab a copy. I can can find exactly what I need right there at my fingertips. I wonder, were there any stories or events in Iowa history in particular that stick with you after having written the book? You've covered 13,000 years of history or something like that. Uh, are there any stories or events in particular that you just keep coming back to?
There are several. The first of which is a story of Sam Byers, who shows up in the chapter on the Civil War repeatedly. And so that chapter is in part wrapped around his story so that readers can understand the progression of the war and the role of Iowans. Sam Byers is one of the first volunteers for the 5th Iowa Infantry. He's from Oskaloosa, and he fights in Missouri, Tennessee, and Mississippi. He's at Vicksburg. He's down in the guerrilla fighting in Missouri. And he has this wonderful memoir called With Fire and Sword. He's eventually taken prisoner, and he escapes from 3 different Confederate POW camps. And he has this incredible story of both fighting in the war and just escaping from and surviving, and then being repeatedly caught by the Southern soldiers. And he ends up the war on Sherman's staff. And if anyone wants to take a look at that, you can find it online, With Fire and Sword. And if anyone knows anyone in Hollywood, I would be glad to write the screenplay. It's an incredible story. Secondly, there's a story of Luther Smith, who is a Tuskegee Airman. And when I started writing this, I did not think I'd come across stories like his, but I should have known better. But Luther Smith, you can find his picture in the Des Moines airport. He was from Des Moines, went to Roosevelt High School, volunteered to serve in the segregated Tuskegee units. He ended up being shot down after 130 or so missions over Europe. And he was badly injured getting out of his plane, ended up as a POW. After the war, he went to University of Iowa and became an engineer. And he was turned down again and again for jobs because of his race. He eventually got a job with, I think, General Dynamics. And he worked for them for 40 years. So those are a couple of stories that really stick out from Civil War and also from World War II.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I always appreciate, when as historians, I feel like we're working with lots of folks, lots of people, lots of stories, that kind of thing. But I often, even in my own work or as an editor, there are certain stories that for whatever reason I come back to and I want to keep telling. And it's always interesting to hear others, think through and answer that question too from their own work. I wonder, at Iowa History Book Club, you've got a new history of Iowa. As you've done this work, did you note anything that was especially distinct about the Iowa experience, as opposed to other Midwestern states or the nation as a whole? And maybe the answer is no, right? But we tell the Iowa story. But is there something distinct about Iowa? Is there something that is exemplary, or also that tells us about broader themes? How would you answer that?
Well, that's a big question. You could write
It
a book.
is, yeah. I apologize.
Yeah. Well, the first of all, and this is going to seem incredibly obvious, is the importance of Iowa's agricultural and rural history. Whether it is from the 1830s through the late 19th century, whether it's settlement, homestead, populism, the Depression, 80s, the reality of Iowa often is rural life, farm life. Iowa was a rural state up into the 1950s. Today, it is still one of the most rural states in the country. It has its rural population is almost 40%. And so Iowa is different from the United States in some ways because of its more agricultural economy, also because it is a state which a much larger proportion of white Americans. It is less diverse, it is less urban, it is more agricultural. But all these things also help explain Iowa's astonishing success with its educational system, especially in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, something that you would associate with one-room schools. Iowa, by about 1900, had one of the most had tied, I think, for first place as the most literate population. And Iowa schools did a great job of educating people. Everyone, uh, people who won, Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, he went to Iowa one-room schools. Harvey William, who ended up helping to come up with helping to make sure that we had uranium for the Manhattan Project. He went to Iowa one-room schools. And so Iowa's is incredible success with its rural education system also is, I think, something that's quite distinctive for the state's history.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's great and very interesting, to think about education. And there is some good histories of education in Iowa, right? But we think about the agriculture, but that emphasis on education is interesting too, because it's perhaps in the water. I remember growing up in Iowa, we heard about how important education is, but it's interesting for you to highlight, how distinctive that was, especially in that late 19th and early 20th century. That groundwork for education is really it's really interesting, and I think that's a great point. I hadn't actually thought about a whole lot before.
Well, we take pride in our school system today. Even if it's it's a little frayed in places, but Iowa still has one of the highest graduation rates in the country.
Mhm.
So we take pride in that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. That's great. I wonder if someone asked you, and maybe that someone's me, uh, what you thought the most important takeaway from this book for Iowa history would be. What's the most important thing, or one of the couple most important things, maybe more than one, that I should take away or our readers should take away from this book.
Well, again, this is going to seem incredibly obvious, but I guess you shouldn't always bury the lead. Is the United States and Iowa have been created by mass immigration over decades and centuries. And that's not to say that those who weren't here before the United States was created did not suffer greatly from the creation of this country, Iowa, the Midwest. But you can make an excellent argument. Immigration is a good thing economically, socially. It's good, especially for states like Iowa that happen to be low growth in terms of its population. If you think immigrants and refugees tend to be more entrepreneurial, they start businesses more often. Uh, if about one half of the businesses that make up the Standard and Poor 500, the largest businesses in the country, were started by immigrants or started by the children of immigrants. And in places like Storm Lake, other small towns, they are kept alive by immigration. Their churches are full, houses are being bought, the schools are full, people are learning English and going to school. So that's a part of the story that shows up again and again. If it's immigration of Germans or Irish or those who might be Italian or African American refugees from the South, or those who came from Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Africa, they help build the state for almost a couple centuries.
Mhm. It's interesting to hear that too, because I'm a historian of immigration by training, religion, immigration, and politics. But I studied the Dutch, of course, or not, of course. Maybe people don't know. I studied the Dutch, but I studied Dutch settlement and immigration. And what's interesting is I have colleagues who study, say, Asian immigration in the 20th century, or immigration from Latin America in later the 20th century. And what's interesting, I find, is that some of the themes, you mentioned entrepreneurial nature. Henry Hospers, who I study in Orange City, was incredibly entrepreneurial, right? So some of these themes that you mentioned, or we might associate with immigrant groups at different periods, really are a through line, even though those groups are coming from very different places at different points in Iowa's history, driven in part by U.S. immigration policy or world events, that kind of thing. I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting point.
It seemed like a very obvious point, and
Mhm.
that's not to interject myself in any political debates, but if you think economically, places like Iowa's rural areas, or I mean, Immigrants are going to be consumers. They're going to be producers. They're going to come with new ideas. They're going to start businesses. There are plenty of examples of that show up in the book.
Yeah, interesting. And like I said, from a variety of time periods, it's a theme that we see as early in the book as some of the first white or European settlers in the state. So I wonder, like, so this goes to one of my interests as well, as a state historian, which is to say, how do state histories, and in this case, a history of the state of Iowa, help us understand regional, national, or international history? So how is this not just the story of Iowa, but how is this also helping us understand broader stories and themes that exist beyond our two rivers, if you will?
Well, by studying a state, you're studying a discrete unit, and you can see how it evolves over time, economically, politically, socially. You can look at immigration as an example of how Iowa's tied to the world. You can look at globalization. You can look at the importance of exports, or everything from the railroads. So what state history can tell us is it can give us a more of a bottom-up history, rather than maybe the larger, broader, top-down history that you might hear in a U.S. survey or high school, where it's presidents and generals and elections and things like that. Iowa can give you a more personal history as well. You can tell the story of Luther Smith or Sam Byers or someone else who may not be able to show up in a larger, broader narrative.
Mhm.
It also provides a more complex story. If you're going to look at things like World War II, how does that affect the home front in Iowa that might be different from something on the coasts, New York or California, for example? So it's going to be more of a bottom-up history. It's going to be more detailed. It's going to be more complex. And it's going to tell us in a different way about how history works over time.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, obviously, I'm a fan of state history, right? I work at the State Historical Society, but I always think it's interesting to think about what we do, as state historians, in as contributing to broader fields of knowledge and on from our own perspective, in our own ways, but with that kind of discrete methodology, right? And there is that kind of connection. I think about teaching. I was up at Iowa State teaching a class last week, in Pam Riney Kerberg's class, speaking to students and being able to tell some stories about places where students live. There's that deep connection to people, in a way that you say, oh, I did know somebody who lived in Paulina, Iowa, or Primgar, that kind of thing. It builds that deep connection, in ways that are really impactful, maybe.
Yeah, and Pam's book on the farm crisis looks at Iowa in that incredibly important, terrible time for
Hmm.
the state. And Iowa's story, in many ways, is the national story at that point.
Hmm. Hmm.
And Pam does a great job with that story,
Hmm.
and the first person to look at it. So that's an example of how state history can inform broader trends
Hmm.
nationally.
Hmm. Absolutely. Great. Well, and I've got one more question I want to ask you before we
Yeah.
shift over to questions and answers from the group, the audience that's here. We've already gotten a couple coming in. This is just a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and put those into the Q&A. We're getting those added to the question list we've got here. We also got some before, when you registered. But if you've got any questions, go ahead and throw those into the Q&A, because we're coming on up to your portion of the evening. But the last question I want to ask is, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, a whole 6 months, if you will, like, is there, but knowing that books, were in production, you were long past the ability to change anything, longer than 6 months ago, maybe closer to a year. Is there anything that you would change about the book? Are there any new insights, or stories that you wish you could have developed or included since the book was published?
Well, the book ends December 31st, 2020. So some of the things we've recently experienced, the end of COVID and politics and so on, is beyond the scope of the book. But I was looking at the book today, thinking about this and the story of education, which is so important for the development of the state. And it kind of trails off in the book in the 50s and 60s with school consolidation. And what I would have, in retrospect, would have liked to have done is spend some more time talking about maybe the diversification of Iowa schools, maybe talking about everything from the number of students and continued consolidation, and we one point is if you think about Iowa, we pride ourselves on our schools. And I was looking around today, and it does not look like in some of the rankings of the best school systems in the country that Iowa is in ranks among the top 10 school systems. And some of those rankings, U.S. News and World Report, Education Week, Iowa, and the National Report Card also will tell us that Iowa's excellence in education and its lead over other states has lessened over time. Iowa, of course, still has excellent graduation rates. Iowa, I think, is #1 in the country in terms of the number of high school kids earning college credit. Recent math scores for fourth graders were excellent. But if you're looking at reading scores overall, they've declined for 20 to 25 years. And so that story of education is something I wish I'd included a little bit more on.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like, and sounds like you were interested in exploring that even more towards the more recent period, which is also, as a historian, I normally don't work with, we often get a little, we get skittish when we get to the more recent, or at least most historians I know get a little skittish when we get too close to the present. So that always is a challenge for us, at least methodologically.
And you're right about that. And one reason the last chapter of the book is on the 21st century, and it covers everything from politics to economic change, the Great Recession, ethanol. It looks at politics, immigration, all the way up to the COVID epidemic in 2020. And so I almost felt like I was doing journalism at a bit, but I thought it was important to at least try to bring up some of the themes and the stories and the trends in Iowa to as close as I could to today. And if there's a place that's most open to criticism, it probably could be that last chapter.
And that's sounds about right for a historian, right? The closer we get to the present, the more we feel like we're opening ourselves up to criticism, because we like things to have a little bit more time to sit between.
Exactly.
It's a hazard of maybe trying to kind of get us to where we were. So I want to give plenty of time for lots of questions from the audience. So I'm going to just kind of offer them to you, but there's also going to be they're going to jump all over the place. So we'll do our best. So the first question we have is, what ethnic group made the greatest contributions to Iowa, or maybe what ethnic groups might you identify as central? I know that naming just one can often be hard. And then there was a question about how many Iowans served in the Civil War. I don't know if those are related, but they came in together. So you can either deal with them at the same time, or maybe treat them separately if you happen to know.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to point at one ethnic group and say that they have been more important than others. There, of course, is the issue of just sheer numbers. And throughout most of Iowa history, its population has been overwhelmingly white. That is a fact. I don't even know how to answer the question about Iowa's ethnic groups. But I can talk about the Civil War. So the number of Iowa soldiers that served in the Civil War was about 76,000. Iowa had about 13,000 die in the war. Iowa actually had, of all the northern Union states, Iowa had a larger proportion of its population die during the war from disease or wounds or death in battle. But Iowa did not have the highest percentage of its male population volunteer for the war. There were several other states that fill in that category.
Yes, I remember I was talking to a colleague and who was catching that, or I had noticed that because often that percentage or per capita is where there's a lot of pride, but understanding how we fit. I think it's Ohio is also in the mix there at the top.
Mm.
I am not a Civil War historian, so I
I-
can't
Neither
speak
am
to
I.
that. But
Leo
um,
Landis probably knows.
yes, I promise you, Leo Landis knows and could tell us right now. Um, my next question is about redistricting, more broadly conceived, right? But it's how did the legislature justify having one representative per county, with the more populated counties having two, until the 1960s? It says that right now that seems like it would be unconstitutional. Or the person says it seems unconstitutional to give some people more power than others. What major laws passed or what constituted this kind of shift in Iowa's broader political structure, I guess you'd say, during that period?
Well, it was unconstitutional, and it was an illegal, you could call it gerrymandering, where rural areas got far more of a say than urban areas. A Supreme Court decision from the United States Supreme Court struck down such legislative, I redistricting and advantage of rural areas in the 60s. And there was this a huge battle in the 60s and 70s over how to reallocate legislative seats to where urban areas were not discriminated against. And that was it because members of the legislature benefited from how the maps were drawn. Um, that's how it ended up. It was maldistributed for decades and decades and decades. In fact, some of the distribution of legislative seats was allocated way back in the early 1900s, even when in the 1950s and 1960s there had been this huge population shift. So that's a brief answer. There is a paragraph in the book on it which summarizes this up.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a question that just came in because it relates to that question about immigrant groups or ethnic
Mhm.
groups. And perhaps this will be a little easier to kind of
Mhm.
gauge, which is
Mhm.
that this asking a question that relates to a recent exhibit at the University of Iowa claimed that Germans were the largest immigrant group until 1971. And so could you help us maybe see not necessarily which was the most significant, but how kind of proportionally or which groups were the largest over time to the extent that you're able? I know Germans were the largest group for quite some time.
Yep. There was significant German immigration as well as Irish immigration. There was large numbers eventually of immigrants from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, of course, from the English Isles as well. Most of those groups tend to be northwestern European. In terms of 20th century immigration, um, the uh, the Congress, well, the federal laws starting in 1920s had kind of shut off the flow of immigrants into the United States from the 1920s into the 1960s. But those groups I mentioned were some of the largest ones. And since the 60s and 70s, you've had a massive inflow into the United States of people from Latin America, Asia, and Africa.
Yeah, I think that the story of immigration, and I say this as someone who's interested in this, right, by nature of my own specialty, is always interesting to consider in light of federal. That's a place where state history is overlapping very much with federal national histories. You can't understand Iowa's immigration story without understanding federal law or without understanding even globally what's happening. I know there's been a little bit of recent work on, say, the larger number of Mexican immigrants in the early 19th or early 20th century that has to do with the Mexican Revolution. And so you have to understand not just what's happening in Iowa, but what might be driving people to leave their homes or drawing them to the country or keeping them out. In the case of, say, Asian immigrants in the area of exclusion.
Yeah, that there were several thousand Mexican immigrants that came to Iowa often to work on railroads They came here fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. They came looking for opportunity, just as people have come to Iowa or have come to the United States for generations and generations.
Mm-hmm.
There was a small number of people who came from the Middle East as well in the early 1900s. And then that flow of people was also added to by African Americans who came to Iowa fleeing the American South, who had come here before the Civil War or had come here and they had volunteered to fight with the 60th Colored Regiment, and they fought for the Union in the Civil War. There were about 10,000 or so African Americans living in Iowa about 1900.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we've got lots of questions coming in, so
Okay.
we're gonna keep moving. So the next one says, that this person bought the book in order to learn about the presence of Indians in Iowa history, and this book didn't disappoint. This person notices that it seems like Minnesotans have a stronger understanding of Indians' role in their history. I'm guessing this person might be living or is from Minnesota. Why isn't do you think that maybe it's less present in Iowa, right, or in Iowa history? Might you say, why do some states, and I think the same, maybe you would look to South Dakota. South Dakota has a much richer study of American Indian life. Minnesota is the same. So how might you understand the role of Indians in Iowa and maybe how that relates to other states that more prominently feature them in their broader histories?
Well, the the first chapter of the book is dedicated to Native Iowa, the Iowans who lived here before Iowa actually became a territory. And that story continues with the Sauk and the Meskwaki and the removal of the Iowa. I think part of the problem is there's not been a lot of literature in the past few decades on Iowa's Native people. The most recent book on Iowa is from the 1970s. The most recent book on at least the last monograph dedicated to the Sauk and the Meskwaki was, I think, 1950s. Now, there might be some additional books coming out,
Yes.
but I think you can bring me up to speed on that. But I think the absence of literature also contributes to that problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, I think that makes sense. It has been there's some people who are doing interesting work and we're publishing some of those pieces. But again, yeah, it's been a while since there's been a real flurry, if you will.
Mhm.
Next question is very broad but very short, and it wonders if you could talk about some especially interested women in Iowa's past.
Okay. Well, there are tons of them. Going back to Louisa Massey, who has Louisa County named after her. She was lived in Iowa in the 1830s, 1840s, famously got involved in a family feud. A member of her family was killed. Then there was a retaliatory killing, and then she ended up shooting one of the members of the family that had ambushed her own family, and then she fled south to St. Louis. There, of course, are women who were farm women who show up in the book in early chapters. There's Annie Wittenmeyer and her importance for Iowa's Civil War history, and her importance for the history of reform and prohibition. And then there's also there are fabulous stories like that of Judith Ellen Foster, who's one of Iowa's first female lawyers. She was from Chicago, married her husband, E.C. Foster. They moved to Clinton. She had been a teacher. She was interested in social reform. They lived in Clinton, which was this rough Riverport full of boisterous, hard-drinking men. And so she was very interested in prohibition and controlling the abuse of alcohol. She was such an effective lecturer that her house was burned down within a year of her starting work on her campaigning. And she was in Iowa for a few years, gave hundreds of speeches, was one of the most prominent Iowa women from Iowa who was involved in prohibition. She ended up moving to Washington, D.C. with her husband. She had a bunch of federal roles. She was a sanitary inspector. She worked with the Red Cross, going to an international meeting in Russia, I think in 1902. She worked for the Department of Justice, investigating female prisons in the early 20th century. So even though she's not in Iowa the entire time she's alive, she plays a key role in the 1870s. Those are a couple examples.
Great. I feel like there's all kinds of great folks we could, a variety, all kinds of great stories in the book and in Iowa history. So that's terrific. I think, this question is interesting to me too. And you kind of talked about it earlier, but I'd love to hear you say a little bit more, which is one, this person said they found the last three chapters to be the most valuable because they helped this person understand what they had lived through, so kind of capturing some of their life. And the question is, how did you decide when to end this history, right? And I think I'd be interested in that too. Like you mentioned that a little earlier too. Like why go all the way until almost the very last moment that you could go, when even Dorothy Schreeder, when she wrote in 1996, kind of cut things off, with a decent gap,
Yeah.
for example, right? She kind of took her foot off the gas, if you will, in the 1950s and 60s and kind of came into a nice smooth sailing. She didn't go all the way to the 90s. And so why did you decide to go as far as you did? And did you ever consider any other options?
Well, I wanted to include as much as I could, as far forward as I could. And I thought 2020 would be an easy point to finish up. I mean, better 2020 than 2015. And there were so many stories that continued after I could have stopped in 2000 or 2010 that I thought were important to talk about the evolution of the state. I mean, Iowa went from a battleground swing state in the early 2000s. Now it is firmly a red state. Iowa's economy has also evolved and changed, especially hard hit by the Great Recession. Of course, 2020 itself took a few pages. It was a fire hose of history that came at us, and also environmental changes. So I went to 2020 so I could try to talk about as much change over time as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an easy place to start. I mean, to stop. 2020 is nice and round as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's always interesting for me to think about, right? As historians, when we tell stories, there is always that decision of where do we stop, and it's both at once artificial but also deeply meaningful. Deciding the exact chronology you're going to go with, because we know the story continues even after even if you finished in 2020, the story has continued for the last 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So this is
maybe in 15 or 20 years, I'll do a second edition and take things up to 2040. If I'm so courageous and still around.
So these, I have a couple questions here that are a little bit, maybe less about the content or the process, but just about what we should know. And the first is they come together, and it's, what do Iowans most need to know about Iowa history? And then what would you say that non-Iowans or people living outside of Iowa should know about Iowa's history? So what do those of us who live here, what should we know, or would you want us to know first? And what do you think we should share with those who live outside the state?
That's you asked a question I could and talk about for 20 minutes.
We've got 15.
Okay. Those of us in Iowa, I would, as I said before, the idea that immigration is important. Immigration is key to building the state. Understanding where people came from, understanding we're all in the same state. We're all in the same country. We're all in the same boat. We need to be concerned about making sure everyone else has the opportunities that we might have had. We need to be concerned about ensuring quality education, making sure that sustainable environment, for example. What Iowans should know? Well, they should read the book. It's only 125,000 words. But in terms of non-Iowans, uh, they should know Iowa is more than farms. Iowa is more than small towns, or its population is more diverse than you might expect. If you think about the caucus, reporters dropped into Iowa, they drove around, they went to campaigns, but I'm not quite sure they talked much about the issues that really matter to people, at least here in the state. And I think for non-Iowans, they should understand it's a diverse place. It is mostly urban, um, and rural areas are hurting. And that at national level, whether it's Iowa or whether it's nationwide, uh, uh, small towns, farmers may get the attention from reporters, but those are the places also that have been most hurt by economic change the past few decades.
Mhm, mhm. That's, and you kind of hit on some themes that, we've mentioned Pam's book on the farm crisis, these kinds of things that help see the ways that Iowa is richly diverse in a variety of ways, right? Not just in the ways that are first thought of, but rural, urban, suburban, exurban, different environments, different climates, different school type systems, that kind of thing. But also that there's a great impact, with something like the farm crisis and what that means even today. So I wonder, and this gets to if we're talking about Iowans or not Iowans, this question asks about the purpose of teaching in schools. And so what would you say, maybe more precisely, how how would you say, why is it important that we teach Iowa history in our schools, to those who are younger, so, and you do work with history education, right? You help teach the teachers who will teach history. And so what's the purpose or value in sharing Iowa's story with our youngest historians?
Well, you're going to have a more personal connection to history that's tied to your town or your city or your state. You're going to understand um, why a one-room school was important for Norman Borlaug. Or especially if maybe your family drives past an old one-room schoolhouse. You're going to understand the importance of farming or agriculture, or the impact of the farm crisis, or Iowa's many diverse peoples, if you see them. And if you experience and you go to school with someone who looks a little different, you go to school with someone who maybe is a child of farmers, that state, local, county history is more tangible to kids. It might be more meaningful to those who might take Iowa history in elementary school than something that's far more distant that happens in Washington, D.C., or happens in Los Angeles, or some foreign national capital.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's great. I remember taking Iowa history with Dorothy Schreeder's book, the blue one, the
Mhm.
blue version. But hearing in stories about people from my community, is one of the first times I was introduced to Iowa history and got interested and invested in history, as a field, which is now my profession. So, this question is about cultural immigrant groups and assimilation and becoming part of Iowa. And this wants to know about ethnic groups that maybe were particularly successful, and there might be some that maybe intentionally were not. I say this as someone who studies Dutch history, right? A group that guarded its borders well. And so when you look at, especially in those early years, all the diverse immigrant groups, really a real mixing pot of European immigrants, especially in those early days of Iowa. Were there groups that kind of jumped in and became full-throated Americans right away? Were there some that maybe, there's a lot of utopians that maybe chose other routes? But could you talk a little bit about the different approaches to assimilation and Americanization that some of those early groups took?
Well, that would in part depend upon where you lived, where you may be more isolated, such as the Dutch in a rural area. Maybe you were working in a coal mine camp, Italians, Welsh, some Czechs, and so on. If you're thinking about a small number of Hungarians who came, they were involved in the utopian community, which then collapsed. Some of them went back to Europe. But if you're looking at those, one example, a couple examples that come to mind that tie to some of our news in the world recently, is there was significant Jewish immigration to Iowa by the early 20th century. They came to Iowa, and of course throughout the country, fleeing repression, fleeing murder, fleeing massacres in Europe, leaving a place that would not accept them for their religion, and coming to Iowa or somewhere else in the United States that might be more accepting. Unfortunately, and Sioux City is an example, Jews who came to Iowa weren't always allowed to work as teachers or work as clerks, and had to, have businesses for each other because they didn't have equal opportunities in society overall. Other groups that came to Iowa that seem to have been extraordinarily happy to have escaped repression include African Americans who had fled the American South. I mentioned before that more than 1,000 Black men volunteered to fight for the Union in the Civil War. African Americans were glad to come to Iowa after the Civil War to be able to go to school, to have opportunities they might not have had elsewhere. Imperfect, not always, of course, accepted as full equals. Buxton is an example as Dorothy Schroeder and her co-authors would also say, a Black utopia, where there was equal opportunity that did not exist elsewhere in the state. So those are a couple examples that also show up in the book.
Mm-hmm. Great. Wonderful. I always think that's interesting to think about the different ways that these groups of folks who came from all over the world chose to integrate, or assimilate in not just in Iowa, but in the broader United States, and how others really guarded, the groups that I study, really guarded their language and their religion in careful ways. So we've got a few more questions and just a few more minutes. I wonder if I think is a great question. As you were working on this book, what were some of the previously untold stories that you thought were the most important to tell?
Well, there are a ton of untold stories. There is the story of Iowa in the 1920s and 1930s is kind of an astonishing one. After World War I ended, Iowa had the largest mortgage debt in the country. Iowans had gone deeply into debt, especially buying farmland when farm prices were high, so they could produce as much as possible for the war effort and to feed Europe and other places. Farm prices fell. Iowa was in a deep recession for most of the 1920s. Iowa had the largest number of bank failures in the United States in the 1920s. And the Iowa banking system collapsed by the early 1930s. And so this unknown story of Iowa is just how awful it was in the 20s. We have the general popular understanding that we had the roaring 20s and everyone benefited. Not true. Rural areas were left behind, and Iowa's suffered terribly long before the Great Depression showed up. And during the Great Depression, New Deal programs poured about $1 billion in 1930s money into Iowa, helping the state to recover, to build infrastructure, to help farms survive, to help take electricity to rural areas. Iowa received more New Deal money than any Midwestern state other than North Dakota or South Dakota. And so that goes to show how difficult the period was. And so those are a couple unknown bits of Iowa's history where the stories have not been fully tied together, and such as the story of Iowa's CCC camps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. That's terrific. I've got two more, at least two more. I'm going to try to ask. There's more out there, but trying to get make our time get through as many as we can. So this might be the second to last one, and this one I think is interesting. It says this person was surprised at the downside of rural mail delivery, how
Mm.
ordering things from afar hurt local businesses, and that this started long before the internet. And so this person wonders what other things that we think of as modern problems or things that came about because of the internet or cars or whatever might actually have historical precedence.
Well, the person just asked a question, hit on one of the most important ones, rural mail delivery. Also thinking about automobiles. We might think of cars today as maybe you don't go to anything, maybe you don't go to any store in your small town and you drive into Des Moines or Iowa City or Cedar Rapids or something. Well, that's been going on for almost 100 years. Iowans bought lots of Model Ts in the 1920s and 30s, and long ago they began to skip their local rural stores, or they begin to not go to their local church, or they went on Sunday drives instead of going to church, or their kids went to school in town, and occasionally a young kid would drive themselves to town. So the kind of things we think about, that the change that automobiles bring in the past few decades can be traced back to before World War II.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And I'm sure there's other things like that, right? Like that have those precedents that we don't often think of, things that we think of as problems now that really, or concerns right now, but have a long history. So we've got about 3 minutes left. And I want to give plenty of time for you to answer. And so this will be the second to last question. I have a different question I'll ask you at the end with the chair's prerogative. So this is the true second to last, which is first. So this person says, first, thank you for writing the book. It's genuinely appreciated. And this person has met a lot of other Iowans all over the world from a wide variety of backgrounds. Maybe you have as well, Jeff, with your travels. And this person's always struck by how strongly Iowans identify with their state and how Iowan they feel. And they wondered, are there any aspects of Iowa's history that you think might account for this deep connection that many Iowans feel to their state?
Well, I think Iowa's rural, small town heritage, its excellent school systems, and its general usual decency, niceness, and also often the acceptance of people that are quite different from us. I grew up in California. I did not know my family's neighbors well. I don't recall a lot of people who would greet me on the street. I didn't have a close tie to my school, since it was a giant school and I was one of 1,000+ people in high school. So you come across a Californian, you talk about not the same things that you might talk about as an Iowa. When you talk about Los Angeles or San Francisco or the good weather or Yosemite, you're not so much tied to the state. Well, we Californians always complain about housing prices, price of gas and so on, which is different from at least much of what you may talk about here.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the small townness, and I'm struck there. One of my mentors and friends, she always compares Iowa to a big small town. She recently started a new job, and I said, "Oh, did you know that your colleague was my summer camp counselor when I was at summer camp at Lake Okoboji in the 1990s?" And she, in exactly the same thing of Iowa being a big small town, that even though we're both living in Des Moines, we had that connection that through a summer camp on Lake Okoboji. So yeah, Iowa as a big small town.
I that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, well, not that credit goes to Susan Claver for
Okay.
that one, not to me, but it's Iowa as a big small town. So the last question I want to ask with our last minute or so, and then I'll let you get to bed, as it's getting later over or earlier over in Poland, is what are you working on now? What can we look for? What's next after this really great contribution to Iowa history?
Well, thank you for the kind words. The next book I have will be a history of Des Moines. I have a book contract with the University of Indiana. They have a new series for a popular audience. It's called Heartland History. And they're looking for histories that people will want to read. And so Des Moines has never had a good history of the city. And so I'm in a process of writing that.
Oh,
Wish me
wonderful.
luck. I'll be down in Des Moines. I'll be asking you for help probably as soon as I get home.
Yes, wonderful. Well, I can't wait to see you. So terrific.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you, Jeff, for staying up late, and to everyone for joining us here tonight. It's wonderful. We are going to wrap up. I want to thank you for everyone for being here. I think we can all agree this has been really informative. We got so many great questions. One of the most inquisitive groups. We tried to get to all of them. I know there were a couple that maybe we didn't make it, but did the best we could. Thanks so much to Jeff for staying up late. I really enjoy the chance anytime we get to chat, and talk about your work and talk about Iowa and state history. I'm really committed to that. Thanks for all you do. We hope everyone will sign up
Thank
for our
you.
next Iowa History Book Club. That'll be taking place in May, and we'll be joined by Connie Mutel, who edited a new book, Tending Iowa's Land, which is more of an environmental approach to Iowa's history, and that conversation will be in May. You can join us and register for that on our website. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series or any of our other websites, other series, you can join us at our website, history.iowa.gov. You can look into our digital programs. You can look at our Goalies Kids Club activities for young historians, watch video recordings of our 101 series. You could even subscribe to the Annals of Iowa or find links to our wonderful digital collections of publications. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and say have a great evening and good night.
Thank you. Thanks.